Jerusalem has been destroyed, and the people have been taken to Babylon. Their lives are a grim shadow of their former glory, and the people lament their fate. But after a generation, hope is restored as their exile ends, and they begin returning home to dwell in the land of their ancestors. And they bring with them a new religion, evolved out of the old theology and brimming with new practices. A religion incompatible with the one they left behind. What they need now is a new prophet, a new Moses to lead them into this promised land and establish a new covenant that gives them sole ownership of Judah and grants them the right to dismiss those who still cling to the old styles of worship. And of course, they must lay the blame of the national disasters squarely at the feet of their religious opponents. Those who still imagine Yahweh as a God that can be seen, a God that can be worshipped anywhere, and a God who still accepts child sacrifices. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. The book of Jeremiah greatly resembles that of Isaiah, and in fact, the two books contain verses that either copied from one another or from a common source, as we covered in the Isaiah episodes. The topic, like Isaiah, is the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonian army. And, like Isaiah, this occurred because the people of Judah had failed Yahweh and turned away from him, engaging in improper worship and breaking his covenant. And like Isaiah, if the people preserved a bit of hope and maintained the memory of their proper religion, then all might one day be restored to them in the future. The recent catastrophe will serve as the backdrop for Yahweh establishing a new covenant, just as the great flood in the time of Noah served to establish the original covenant. Humans are flawed creatures, and their mistakes are the cause of their own suffering, their misdeeds bringing about destruction. What occurred in Jerusalem wasn't Yahweh's fault, even though he directly sent the army to crush them, but the fault of the victims. They invited disaster through their own sin. This message shouldn't surprise any long-time listeners of this show, as it's one that the biblical authors had preached since Deuteronomy. Another similarity with Isaiah is the genre of writing, as the core of the book is comprised mostly of prophetic oracles, focused on themes of divine judgment. This makes up chapters 1 to 25. The time frame given for Jeremiah's visions begins with the 13th year of the reign of King Josiah and ends with the 11th year of King Zedekiah, giving us a span of 40 years from 627 BCE to 587 BCE, concluding with the beginning of the Babylonian exile. This 40-year period is deliberate, as it reflects Moses, the prototypical Deuteronomic prophet, as outlined in Deuteronomy 18:15, where the future prophets would be raised up by Yahweh from among the people. Just as Yahweh set up a prophet to serve 40 years, beginning with the liberation from Egypt, so too does he establish another prophet who ends his career as the people of Jerusalem are led into captivity in Babylon. The timeline in the book of Jeremiah is a total mess, indicating these are a collection of oracles pertaining to different periods and aren't arranged in chronological order. Some of the earliest oracles are found in later chapters, while oracles that take place later in Jeremiah's life are included in the earliest chapters. And since this book was assembled after the exile had ended, we find chapters concerning Jeremiah leading a group of refugees out of Judah and into Egypt following the destruction, as well as exiles journeying back to Jerusalem after Babylon's crushing defeat at the hands of the Persians. Finally, there existed at least 3 different versions of Jeremiah in the pre-Christian period. The Masoretic variant, the Septuagint variant, and another that we will call the Qumran variant, though that may be a bit misleading as all 3 versions were preserved in Hebrew by the residents of the Qumran community. This means that Orthodox Jews preserved only one version, Christians preserved another, and both groups ignored a third version that existed at the same time. To date, there is no way of knowing which was the original version of this book, or if any of these were the original. Finally, we can address the structure of the book. The first 25 chapters of Jeremiah are similar to the first 39 chapters of Isaiah in that they seem to be the core upon which the rest of the book was built. These chapters represent what is likely to be the original book of Jeremiah, with the remaining chapters being appended to the text at a later date. These prophetic oracles begin with a call of the prophet scene similar to what we saw with Isaiah, and conclude with a summary of the refusal of the people to follow Yahweh's covenant and their choice to ignore the words of the prophet, which ultimately leads to their destruction. Appended to this work are 5 additional sections. Chapters 26 to 29 contain Jeremiah's interactions with other prophets. 30 to 33 contain Yahweh's promise of restoration. Chapters 34 to 45 are the interactions with Zedekiah and the fall of Jerusalem, followed by Yahweh's wrath against nations near Israel in chapters 46 to 51. And the book concludes with a retelling of the second book of Kings. And this detail, the retelling of 2 Kings, raises an important question given the importance of this prophet. Why does the book of Kings never mention him? Many scholars believe the reason is a simple one. Jeremiah is a fictional character. He's meant to be the ideal prophet, an archetypal figure invented by those who follow Deuteronomic theology in the exilic or post-exilic period. And with the overview out of the way, let's dive in. The book opens with a line that tells us that what follows are the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, a priest from Anathoth. While this may sound like the name of some unspeakable horror from the works of H.P. Lovecraft, Anathoth is actually the name of a small village northeast of Jerusalem, where Abiathar was exiled by Solomon in the beginning of 1 Kings. This means Jeremiah is supposed to be descended from that line of priests. Jeremiah is singled out by Yahweh and dedicated to the role as prophet of the nation. This chapter suggests parallels with Moses, including his hesitation and Yahweh's response to support him. And like Moses, Jeremiah will be the deliverer of Yahweh's words. He is tasked to deliver 2 messages for Yahweh, one of destruction and another of rebuilding. And throughout this book, Jeremiah and Moses will be repeatedly compared. The looming destruction of Judah is depicted as a boiling pot tipping over in the north, threatening to scald the inhabitants of the land. Yahweh has summoned Jerusalem's enemies to march against the city and surrounding towns for their sin of offering sacrifices to gods besides Yahweh. But at the end of the chapter, he offers hope. Despite the dangers they face, they will not be completely overcome, nor will they be destroyed, because Yahweh himself will offer salvation to his chosen people. Like Moses, who may very well be based in part on Jeremiah, our prophet is given a magical staff. In this case, it's from an almond tree, according to verse 11. And this verse also contains a bit of wordplay in the Hebrew. Yahweh will be watching, shoked, over Jeremiah, and the prophet has a staff, shaked, as a symbol of his position. Linking the symbol of his authority with the watchful gaze of his patron deity indicates to us that his prophetic mission is dependent on the deity's watchfulness, and this message is reiterated in the following verse. Beginning in chapter 2, we have a series of oracles collected into a single place that stretches to chapter 4, verse 2, which deals exclusively with Yahweh's desire to bring devastation to the city of Jerusalem. Despite being the chosen people whom Yahweh compares to the first fruits of the harvest, they betrayed him and abandoned their God. He led them through the wilderness and brought them to the promised land, yet there they did abhorrent things. Because of this, he has decided to curse the descendants of those idolaters. Yahweh rhetorically asks if any other nation has ever changed its gods, which is a bit ironic as Yahweh wasn't the original deity worshipped by the Israelites. Much of this oracle is presented as a marital dispute. Jerusalem is Yahweh's bride, and in their youth they were devoted to one another, but the wife was engaged in adultery, a familiar reference to the people of the city worshipping other gods. The wife refuses to serve her husband, and predictably he turns violent, harming and shaming her, and ultimately this ends in divorce. The themes of spousal abuse and their portrayal as the proper behavior of a righteous and angry husband gives us a clear look into the minds of the author and the audience. In their culture, women are to be dutiful and obedient in all things, and refusal is punished by physical attacks, humiliation, and dismissal. This first section ends in chapter 3, verse 5, with the abused wife asking of her own parents if her husband's anger and abuse will ever end, or if he'll hate her for all time. While this oracle uses the wife of Yahweh to represent the population of Jerusalem, we must remember that this is done to obscure the older polytheistic myth in which the city represented the actual wife of God, and worship of that goddess was being rejected, just as Yahweh here rejects his figurative wife. See the previous episodes on Isaiah for more information on this topic. A new oracle begins in verse 6 of chapter 3 with Yahweh pointing to the wrongdoing of Israel, the rebel. The nation went to whoring on mountaintops and beneath leafy trees, a reference to worship on hilltop shrines and sacred groves. Because of her disloyalty, Yahweh divorced her, presumably by sending the Assyrians to destroy that nation. But no sooner had he been done with her, but her sister Judah became a traitor and followed in her footsteps. Her sin was committed with stone and wood, the use of idols, when God was supposed to be without physical representation. And, like her sister Israel, Judah did not return to her husband. So Yahweh tells this prophet to warn Judah and command her to return to her husband. Recognize her sin, and she may still see his mercy. He promises to give them shepherds, which are prophets, to instruct them. We find an interesting line in Jeremiah 3:16 when Yahweh speaks of a time of prosperity when the people shall no longer speak of the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, nor shall it even come to mind, mention it, miss it, or ever make another. Why would Yahweh wish for the Ark of the Covenant to be forgotten? The Ark, as discussed in previous episodes, was a symbol of the divine king and the throne of Yahweh. In the time of the Second Temple, when this book was written, Judah was the property of the Persian Empire and no longer had its own king, and the physical seat of Yahweh was no more. It was seen as a relic of the old cult which had fallen out of fashion, along with depictions of the god, the worship of his brothers and sisters, and other aspects of the First Temple. As such, the Ark of the Covenant was no longer welcome in the time when Jeremiah was being written. Instead of Yahweh being seated on a physical throne inside the temple complex, the city would serve as a metaphorical throne, the center of his power. The people have gone astray, ignoring Yahweh, and are warned to turn back from their rebellious actions, but the shameful deeds which persist through the generations have doomed them. But if they return, according to the opening lines of chapter 4, and remove the idols from Yahweh's presence, then the nations shall bless and praise themselves by Judah. The next section of Jeremiah begins with chapter 4, verse 3, and runs through the end of chapter 6, and concerns Yahweh's wrath as expressed through the Babylonian conquest. Yahweh begins by instructing the inhabitants to open their hearts to him and repent their wicked acts, lest his wrath break forth like an unquenchable fire. They take refuge inside the walled city as he brings evil and great disaster from the north to ruin their city according to his blazing anger. The priests and prophets will stand appalled at Yahweh's actions. Jeremiah responds to Yahweh's threats by claiming that God must have deceived the people, as he promised peace to the inhabitants, but the invader speeds along in chariots that move like a whirlwind. So the people are encouraged to wash their hearts clean of their wickedness and no longer harbor wicked designs. The people of Jerusalem weep in misery at the suffering brought on as their bitter punishment takes the form of a disastrous war that ravages the land. The sound of horns fills the air, and mountains tremble under Yahweh's anger. Entire cities are deserted, and the people are doomed. And the voice of Zion cries out in anguish, like a woman in childbirth, a scene that appeared several times in the book of Isaiah. In chapter 5, Yahweh challenges the prophet to search the streets of Jerusalem for a single righteous man, and should such a man be found, he will pardon the entire city. This mirrors the scene from Genesis 18 when Abraham pleads with Yahweh to pardon Sodom, and the challenge is an issue to find righteous people living within the city. The prophet intercedes on behalf of the populace in much the same way as the high priest of the divine king, who communes with the patron deity for the remission of sins in the ancient world. We've also seen this theme in 1st Enoch in the Book of Watchers, when Enoch intercedes on behalf of the rebellious angels and presents their case to Yahweh. Yahweh's attempts to discipline the nation, striking them and inflicting pain, but they refuse to be yoked by his rules. So he sends predators to devour them. Depicting foreign invaders as predatory animals is also a theme we've seen before in the Psalms and 1st Enoch, in a section known as the Animal Apocalypse. Despite even this, the people rebelled against Yahweh. Their sin of following foreign gods is depicted as chasing after a neighbor's wife, as well as perverting justice and preying upon the weak. Above all else, their prophets have spoken falsely, revealing that the main thrust of this oracle is a pronouncement against the false prophets. We saw this in Deuteronomy. Those who disagree with the written message are considered false and invite disaster. So Yahweh threatens to prune the vines of Judah for their sins. The consuming army he sends is described as having quivers like yawning graves, and they'll devour the sons and daughters, harvests and flocks, vineyards and towns. However, Yahweh won't put an end to the people entirely. Even though they served other gods besides Yahweh, he won't entirely destroy them, but they must be made to tremble in fear at his presence. Despite many of the accusations being levied against those in power, such as the prophets, priests, and government officials, the entirety of the population is implicated in this betrayal. They feigned piety, and now they will suffer for it. So the people are encouraged to flee from Jerusalem in chapter 6 as Yahweh's evil approaches from the north. Remember that in this stage of Jewish development, evil was still the purview of Yahweh. A cosmic evil had yet to be invented, and so all things, from good to wicked, and everything in between, come from the sole source of creation, which is Yahweh. This troublesome idea would later give rise to the concept of Satan as an independent force, but at this time they still follow the same idea which was found in Isaiah 45:7, which states, "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, Yahweh, do all these things." The vengeful God declares his intention to destroy the lovely and delicate Zion by sending shepherds and flocks against her. Remember the Enoch episodes where rulers of nations were depicted as shepherds, and the armies and citizens were their flocks. The shadow grows long as night approaches the city, an indication of impending destruction. The land will be made barren, over-harvested and uninhabited because the people have refused to listen to Jeremiah's warning, and Yahweh is consumed by wrath. Violence shall be poured out over the infants and the youth. Men and women shall be enslaved according to the will of Yahweh for their greed and shameful acts. As seen in the previous chapter, all the people are guilty, and innocence simply cannot be found. Even their ritual sacrifices are rejected, as this is as much a theological dispute between rival cults as it is a rejection of greed and injustice. After Jeremiah fails again to set the nation straight, Yahweh issues a poem of war in verses 22 to 26, in which he again speaks of an invading army marching from the north, brandishing weapons and lacking mercy. They're said to be like the roaring sea, the very image of chaos and destruction and enemy of Yahweh, as the sea is personified by the primordial dragon that Yahweh defeated in order to create the world. The people despair, and they must hide in the walled cities, for their destroyer has come upon them. Yahweh has rejected them like waste metals unfit for purification. Chapters 7 to 10 cover two topics. First is the temple and ideal worshippers, which can be found in 7:1 to 8:3, 9:11 to 15, 9:22 to 25, 10:1 to 16, and 10:23 to 25. This section reiterates the Deuteronomic ideals and calls out profane practices such as shedding innocent blood, oppressing resident aliens, widows, and orphans, and speaking false oaths. The second theme encountered is the funeral song for Jerusalem, which is found in chapter 8, verses 4 to 22, 9, 1 to 10, 9, 16 to 21, and 10, 17 to 22. Jerusalem is personified as a weeping mother, whose destruction is brought on by the failures of Jeremiah's generation. We start in chapter 7 with Jeremiah receiving another message from Yahweh. He, meaning Yahweh, instructs the people to correct their behavior and they'll be allowed to live in Jerusalem. This is classic Deuteronomistic theology, the covenant with Yahweh involving a land deal. Prior to the Babylonian exile, their literature didn't seem concerned with this concept, as the people took their residency as a given. We would also expect to see a command to maintain justice, not to oppress widows and orphans, and not to worship other gods, which appears in verses 5 to 6. Of course, the author must deny that they were ever connected with Baal, because their argument was to pretend that Baal was a foreign deity that the Israelites had been tricked into following, and not their own national deity which they had always worshipped. Because of their shift to a new style of worship, their old religion had to be discouraged, and so it was by declaring it as a foreign idea, which was alien to their ancestors. This is an argument by a post-exilic cult that the pre-exilic cult didn't worship Yahweh correctly. That is to say, the new Yahwistic cult accuses the older cult of not following new guidelines for their religious practice. The greed of temple priests is compared to thievery, a polemic we'll see again in the New Testament when Jesus levies this exact same charge against the Second Temple. This too should be no surprise, as the situation is quite similar. An author writing in the aftermath of the temple's destruction at the hands of foreign invaders uses improper worship practices and priestly greed to explain the tragedy. It's the reason books like Jeremiah and Isaiah are referenced so many times by the New Testament. Just as destruction came to Shiloh, Yahweh will bring his ruin to Jerusalem. And when the people failed to heed his warning and continued their wickedness, he instructed the prophets not to attempt intercession on their behalf. They had gathered wood for burnt offerings and made cakes for the Queen of Heaven. This is a reference to Asherah worship that was once prominent in Israel, but was eventually suppressed. Yahweh realizes that the people have now decided their course, and any attempts by the prophets to dissuade them will be fruitless. Yahweh is most displeased with the people for erecting shrines and sacrificing their children as burnt offerings, a practice which he claims he had never commanded. However, Exodus 22 specifically states that the firstborn of their cattle, sheep, and even their children must be given to Yahweh. This too is another polemic against the ancient practice, which was very much part of Yahweh worship. Note that it doesn't state that these sacrifices were for other gods, but were in fact made to Yahweh. The argument the cult makes here is that Yahweh doesn't actually want these types of sacrifices. This is a theological dispute between two different groups of Yahweh worshippers. One group maintains child sacrifice, while the other group has abandoned the practice. And just as Jeremiah 3:16 looks forward to a time when the Ark of the Covenant would be abandoned forever, so does 732 hope for a time when the burnt offerings in the Hinnom Valley would be forgotten. This is the hope that the ancient practices of the older Yahwistic cult would be completely supplanted by the Reformed religion, backed by Persian money and influence. The chapter closes with the hope that these apostates will become like the carcasses they left behind, food for birds and beasts in the valley outside the city. This imagery of a fiery place of sacrifice being populated by rotting corpses of their enemies of this reformed religion will eventually give rise to the idea of the Christian hell. The thread continues in the opening verses of the next chapter, as the bones of priests, prophets, and kings will be loosed from their graves inside of Jerusalem. Not even death can save the wicked from their punishment, it seems. We jump to chapter 9, verses 11 to 15, as the prophet asks why the land is in ruins like a wilderness, to which Yahweh replies that the people had forgotten his teaching and failed to obey him, choosing instead to follow the foreign gods of their fathers. For this they're being punished and will be scattered among the nations, and many will be slaughtered. The topic resumes in verse 22 with an admonition against relying on one's own strength and wisdom, but instead in the devotion to Yahweh, for he acts with kindness and justice. Though I feel that human sacrifice, punishing an entire people for the sins of their ancestors, and promoting genocide might not be considered kindness. Yahweh will soon judge all of the nations, and those who are uncircumcised will be punished, and all of the house of Israel is uncircumcised in their hearts. No longer will they be his chosen people, but instead will be among his enemies. He warns against following portents in the sky, meaning astrology, a practice once popular among the Israelites but now out of favor. Another profane practice is felling a tree and decorating it with silver and gold. This, contrary to popular belief, is not a reference to Christmas trees. These are the famous Asherah poles that once decorated the Jerusalem temple. Tree trunks were carved and decorated and served as focal points in the worship of various deities in Israel, including Yahweh and his female consorts. This section seeks to proclaim Yahweh's exclusive worship by rejecting those practices which are used in the ancient cult and the worship of other deities. These other gods can't speak to people, nor can they act. They're nothing more than human creations. Yahweh alone possesses power, as only he is a true living God, and rival nations can't endure his wrath. Another feature of this section in chapter 10 is to refute the idea that Yahweh couldn't defend his own people when armies that worshipped rival gods easily invaded and defeated them. When a nation lost a battle or a war, it was seen as a defeat of their patron deity. And after losing to the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, Yahweh seemed weak. This hymn, found in chapter 10, seeks to refute the notion by claiming that the gods that saw victory didn't even exist, and their armies were instead sent by Yahweh. It's the last argument they could make, as they certainly couldn't claim that he was more powerful than the likes of Marduk, as clearly he was not. The hymn skips to the final verses of chapter 10 as the prophet asks on behalf of the people for his own punishment. But he also asks for Yahweh to show mercy and not destroy him completely, and to also direct some of his wrath to the very nations that were sent to destroy Judah. We now jump to the funeral song of Jerusalem, which takes us back to chapter 8, verse 4, and continues to 9:10, picks up in 9:16 to 21, and concludes with 10:17 to 22. The cause of Jerusalem's destruction is the rebellious nature of its residents. They refuse to acknowledge their wickedness. Their scribes have written untrue words, and they rejected wisdom, and those claiming to be wise shall be shamed. The priests and prophets are corrupt, and lead the people to stumble before Yahweh, who will put an end to them. Their judgment is likened to a harvest, as we've seen numerous times in the Isaiah episodes, and a few verses later the author even states that they should have been saved during the time of harvest, yet that salvation has not come. Their fortunes are bleak as the invading army approaches, sent against them like attacking serpents. See Numbers chapter 21. There's no relief to be found, no healing nor physician to aid them, and the author laments, "Is there no balm in Gilead?" Either Gilead was known as a source for healing ointments, or Jeremiah was a fan of Edgar Allan Poe. I'll let you decide which. The people are compared to adulterers and rogues, alluding to their idolatry and greed. And they can't be trusted even by their own brothers. They lie and cheat, deceiving even their own friends. So Yahweh will punish them for their wicked deeds and lay waste to the land and turn Jerusalem into a ruin fit only for wild beasts. The singers are summoned to begin their wailing lament for the ruined city. Death has climbed in through the windows and entered the fortresses to slay babies and young men in the streets, a reference to the wholesale slaughter at the hands of the Babylonians. This is why Israelite songwriters dreamed of smashing the heads of Babylonian infants. They sought vengeance for what was done to them when Jerusalem fell. And in chapter 9, verse 21, we see this judgment again compared to the harvest. The thread is taken up again in the middle of chapter 10 as the residents are suffering under the siege, and Yahweh threatens to disperse the survivors as punishment. Jerusalem, personified as a mother, laments that her children have been cast away from her because their leaders didn't seek Yahweh and are now being punished by an army from the north. In chapters 11 to 20, we encounter Jeremiah as an interlocutor with Yahweh as he performs his duties as a prophet. Yahweh begins by commanding his prophet to listen to the terms of his covenant and recite them to the men of Judah. The covenant between Yahweh and the people resembles that of a Western Asian suzerainty treaty in which the ruling party outlines the duties and responsibilities that the vassal state must follow in order to maintain relative autonomy. As with many of these contracts, this one begins with a brief section concerning the identity and history of this relationship. We find this in chapter 11, verses 4 to 5, as Yahweh reminds the people that he freed the people from Egypt and assisted their fathers who accepted him as their God. Then he guided them to the promised land, which he gave to them. The covenant with Yahweh, as found here in Deuteronomy and in the Ten Commandments, is based on a classic suzerain treaty from the neighbors such as the Assyrians or Persians. Unfortunately, the people of Judah refused to listen to the public recital of the covenant and instead follow their own wicked ways, betraying the treaty established with Yahweh. This is presented as a return to paganism of their ancestors. Remember that in some places the people were always followers of Yahweh, but strayed to follow gods of neighboring nations, whereas other verses claim that they had started off as pagans but discovered Yahweh later on. These are two different arguments used by the later Yahwists to distinguish themselves from the older cult. Because they have both broken this covenant, they will be punished just as Israel had been. And just as the people had ignored Yahweh when he cast them out, so too will he ignore them when they cry out for assistance. And if they instead call out to a foreign god that they worship, they'll find no aid there, as those other gods are powerless to help. And as much as Jeremiah would like to help, he's ordered not to intercede on their behalf. He shouldn't pray because Yahweh will not listen. Their fate is already sealed. In verses 18 to 23, Yahweh shows Jeremiah a vision that reveals a conspiracy to kill the prophet to silence him forever. Once Jeremiah understands the treachery of the rulers of Jerusalem, he's swayed to Yahweh's side, and they stand in solidarity on the matter of Judah's destruction. He personally calls for divine retribution. In chapter 12, Jeremiah mimics the voice of Job, laying charges against Yahweh despite his own admission that he cannot win such a legal case. You will win, O Yahweh, if I make charges against you, yet I shall present these charges. And the charges he recounts have all been seen before. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are the workers of treachery at ease? You have planted them, and they have taken root. They spread out, and they even bear fruit. These complaints appear again in both Job and Ecclesiastes. See episodes 72, 73, and 79. They also resemble the individual lament psalms that we covered in episode 74. In this psalm that covers the first 13 verses of chapter 12, the singer laments the fate of the land, asking rhetorically how long the land must languish and if the beasts and birds must perish for the sins of the people. These are the complaints and accusations found in the lament psalms. The enemies are described as a mob, another feature of the lament psalm, which appear in 40 examples of that genre. The psalm shifts tunes from lamenting their miserable position to calling for the destruction of the wicked. They're evil and deserving of punishment. This is the expected call for aid, which is the third and most important feature of the lament psalm. The leaders are presented as shepherds, and they've betrayed their role and their subjects, trampling the fields and hurting their charges, bringing suffering to the whole of the land. And finally, we see Yahweh being persuaded to action, the fourth feature of the lament and the actual purpose of the writing of those psalms. The singers desire change, and Yahweh responds by devouring his enemies across the land with a sword. No flesh is safe from his wrath, and of course this judgment is presented as a great reaping harvest. And the fifth feature, expressing trust in Yahweh, often by a cry of praise, comes at the end of his lament when they cry out, "By the blazing wrath of Yahweh." We then return to the words of the prophet as he again recounts his message from his patron deity. Yahweh will uproot the wicked neighbors as they encroached on his land that was given to his people. So he promises judgment to the very people that he used to punish the lands of Judah, the Babylonians. Once he's punished them for expressing his wrath on Jerusalem, then the Judahites will return to his favor. And just as they once swore to Baal, they shall now swear to Yahweh, using the same oath, but with a new name. And this tidbit is important. The parallels between Yahweh and Baal are so numerous that they could fill their own episode. Because of this, it's long been thought that Yahweh is another version of that Canaanite deity, and in light of their names having the same meaning, both mean Lord, and both resting atop the same mountain, Zaphon, it's not difficult to draw these conclusions. But even the Hebrew Bible links them, as we see here. The people are instructed to continue using a formulaic oath to swear by the name of their deity, but they're to call him Yahweh instead of Baal. Sure, we could read this as switching from one god to another, but that's not what they're doing. We know this because of Hosea 2:16, when a similar scene plays out. The people are called to make this same exact change. But there, it's more explicit. The author actually acknowledges that Yahweh is just another name for Baal, and it's time to abandon his older name. Here, I'll read it for you. "In that day, declares Yahweh, you will call me my husband, and no longer call me Baal." So I believe that's what we're seeing here at the end of chapter 12 of Jeremiah, another instance of the Israelites switching from the old name of Baal to the new name of Yahweh, not a rejection of a foreign god in favor of their national deity, because Baal was their national deity. They were just identifying the name with a style of worship that they were attempting to repress. In chapter 13, Yahweh decides to demonstrate to Jeremiah what has happened with the people of Judah. The prophet is told to soak a loincloth in water and then bury it in soil in a cleft in the rocks. After some period of time, perhaps 40 days, because that's how these things often go, he's instructed by Yahweh to return to the place where he buried his undies and dig it up. What he finds is that the loincloth isn't very good for anything because it's filthy and rotten. And that, says Yahweh, is what has happened to Judah. The people have become like a pair of dirty undies. I suppose this is the parable of the pantaloons. Look, if your shorts are so bad that they resemble garments that have been buried in a cave for a month, you need to buy new underwear, and I shouldn't have to be the one to tell you this. So Yahweh will ruin the overwhelming pride of Judah, just as the dampness and dirt ruined Jeremiah's underwear. Such is the fate for improper worship. Then he takes the horrible imagery of people as dirty underwear and makes it really, really gross when well, see for yourself. "For as the loincloth clings close to the loins of a man, so I brought close to me the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah, declares Yahweh, that they might be my people, for fame and praise and splendor, but they would not obey." So, yeah, Yahweh wanted the people to cling to him like a loincloth clings to a man's loins in the sweltering heat of the Judean desert, close and clingy to his loins. That's what being close to Yahweh is like. That's so great. Okay, we're going to get through the rest of this chapter so that I can take a few showers after reading that part. So Yahweh tells Jeremiah to have the inhabitants fill every jar with wine so the king's priests, prophets, and all the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem will be drunk and easier to destroy and deserving of said destruction. This is akin to Yahweh hardening Pharaoh's heart so he can make an example of him. He set his mind to destroying Judah, and causing them to be drunk all the time provides him with an excuse. We're then treated to a poetic oracle beginning in verse 15, which invites the listeners to heed the prophet's words before Yahweh brings the darkness, and they stumble into shadow. Yahweh's flock is taken captive, and royalty must sit in a lowly place as the cities are closed down, and the people are exiled by an army from the north. The nations shall experience pain like a woman in childbirth, the goddess of Jerusalem mourning the destruction of her city as she's humiliated and shamed, her skirts lifted up to expose her nakedness. Thus is the punishment measured out by Yahweh for ignoring him. The chapter ends with the prophet asking how much longer the destruction and desolation will last. That's going to wrap it up for this episode, and I'm off to take that shower. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsofgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes.